After 4 years of declining Series A activity in biotech, last year brought a bit of stability in the number of biotechs able to raise startup capital. On today's BioCentury This Week podcast, we assess biotech's Series A class of 2025. Plus, compounded Wegovy is more than a scam. It threatens innovation. Steve Usden is here to tell you why. And more from Steve in Washington. Last week's spending law represents a rebuke, proposed White House biomedical cuts, and serendipity. It drives discovery in psychiatry drug development, but it's engineering that gets it across the line. We have takeaways from Selena Koch's conversation with Steve Paul, formerly of Karuna, currently of Seaport. He joined our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues
Simon Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Danielle Golovin, senior biopharma analyst.
Steve Usden, Washington editor.
And Selena Koch, executive editor.
All right, we will turn to Danielle and her brilliant deep dive into Series A companies and their technologies. But first, we're excited to introduce a new exclusive opportunity for BioCentury subscribers launching at the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit. That will be in March 9th through the 11th. Step inside the BioCentury Lounge, a dedicated space designed to connect, recharge, and inspire conversation among industry leaders. Experience unique networking moments, insider insights, and a place to unwind between sessions at our 5th East-West Summit. Don't wait. Check out more at biocenturylounge.com. Okay, Danielle, this has become a thing. Your Series A analysis. I don't know if we're in year 3 or 4, but it's always something I really look forward to reading each year because you remind us of who some of the hottest, newest companies are and who the investors are backing them. What was the main takeaway from your analysis? And I should say your analysis with our colleague, Lindsay Martin, who did a lot of the data for this deck.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Lindsay, who helped me big time this year. And the big good news is that 2025 stopped the downward slide in Series A activity. So after 4 years of going down, 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 this year we have 146 Series A rounds. And last year we had 149, so basically stabilizing. And even though the total number of raises were the same, the total amount raised was $8.1 billion, and this is up from $7 billion the prior 2 years. And while the number of 100 million plus mega rounds was similar in 2025 to 2024, there were 7 mega rounds at over 200 million. That's the most in 5 years. We also saw the largest raise in 5 years. This is Verdiva Bio's $411 million raise. Verdiva is developing an oral GLP-1 peptide, as well as oral and sub-Q amylin agonists for obesity and other cardiometabolic diseases.
Danielle, let's talk a little bit about who's in these rounds. I think you also looked at, the most active investors, and interestingly, kind of the sizes of syndicates was also something you saw a change in.
Yeah, exactly. So Eli Lilly and Novo Holdings were the most active investors, participating in 11 rounds each. And if we looked at broke it down by the number of investors for Series A rounds, only 6% of investors go it alone. That's the smallest percentage for solo investment when compared with the past 4 years prior. And I guess accordingly, the bigger syndicates, so syndicates with 5+ investors, rose to 56%. And that's up from 42% last year.
Okay, well, it's kind of interesting that Lilly and Novo were the most active. Of course, both of them have lots of money now. And both of them are obviously the leaders in the GLP-1. So we're going to be keeping an eye on those investments and seeing strategically, as we kind of go a little deeper into this in the future, how much those companies are branching out and using their deep pockets to be stimulating company formation in different areas. Maybe you can talk a little bit about whether there were modality or technology themes among the Series A companies. Anything that, what specifically caught your eye?
Yeah, sure. So as far as modality, as usual, the biggest category was small molecules, 37 companies. Next was antibodies at 27. Within antibodies, we broke it down a bit to bispecifics, T cell engagers, B cell depletion strategies. And then despite, safety setbacks and commercial challenges, cell and gene therapies came in third and fourth. Among cell therapies, ex vivo autologous CAR Ts are still the most popular choice. But we did find one purely in vivo CAR T company called Stylus, and then a second, T Curix, which mentions potential for in vivo. We also identified two companies each making CAR-Ms, CAR macrophages, and CAR NK cells. Within technology, I mentioned B cell depletion strategies, so we highlighted four companies there making biologics for autoimmune disorders. That's Hinge, LTZ, Oro, and Timberline. So check out my BioRender laying out those technologies.
One thing I thought was really interesting when I looked at these data was the strong showing by cell and gene therapy, but especially gene therapy, was above RNA modalities in terms of number of companies getting Series A funding last year, which is just backwards from the clinical picture, right? We see all kinds of pharma saying, look, RNA is scalable. RNA is the future. RNA interference in particular is, really taking off, and we're making these big investments. And then at the most innovative end, these really early stage companies, you see this like maybe a little budding of a comeback of gene therapy.
Yeah, I think that has to do with vehicle delivery. A chunk of these companies are focused on targeted delivery, and that's essential when you're, delivering a gene therapy or a gene editing program, which we also saw a small cluster in gene editing and gene writing.
So a question I actually want to bring in Selena and Jeff, maybe respond to this as well. I thought it was interesting, the number of companies or the proportion of companies that at their Series A financing have a pharma deal, right? And that seemed to be quite substantial. And I sort of wonder whether you're thinking that, coming out of this bear market and this sort of environment where it's been really hard to raise funds, whether that's just put an over-indexing or overemphasis on the value of a validating deal from a pharma company. Sort of do you think it's just the same as ever, or do you think that like in this environment, that's just going to be an even bigger, say, draw for investors if you walk in with a pharma in your pocket from a deal?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, Simone. I guess I was thinking about it in the other way, more from the pharma perspective of, all the patent cliffs coming, the need to go earlier and earlier to tap into some of the innovation that these companies are bringing forth.
Yeah, I mean, both can be true, Jeff. We don't know. And, the numbers have been so low in recent years. We don't know if this is an increase over other years or something. But I do think that it's always a thing for small companies just to be able to create that pharma deal. And so there's the pharma point of view, which you pointed out. And then there's the sort of validating thing from the small company's point of view.
Yeah, hugely validating. That's for sure.
And before you get that Series A, I mean, Series A's have been hard to come by, right? So if you can get some funding somewhere else, then
you do.
And why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Yeah. They can help you, they can synergize or whatever.
How about indications, Danielle? Were there any leading indications around which these companies are being formed?
Yeah, so as usual, most Series A's went to cancer companies with 51. Next was 31 in I&I, 24 in neuro, and 25% of those in neuro were in neuropsych. So I thought that was interesting. We identified rare disease and pulmonary as growing areas, and women's health finally made the chart. Yay! In rare disease, we identified 13 companies with, their lead product is in a rare disease, and it spans neurology, metabolic, muscle, renal, ophthalmic, and derm. In pulmonary, we identified 5 companies, 4 of which have a lead program in COPD. So again, thought that was interesting. And 2 of the 4 in COPD, Novo invested in, just to mention that they are branching out outside of obesity. And as far as women's health, we have Repronovo, Granada, Volastra, and NK Cell Tech. So Repronovo is advancing an oxytocin receptor antagonist for embryo implantation and adenomyosis. Granada has a pipeline to improve reproductive health, and Volastra and NK Cell Tech have lead programs in ovarian cancer.
You had mentioned Lilly being pretty busy. They participated in two of the rare neuro plays, Alchemab and Augustine. I guess to Simone's earlier point, 6 of the companies in rare disease have a deal with another biotech or pharma. Lilly being one of them, Alchemab, that's an ALS.
I thought it was striking that there were more psychiatry companies in that Series A list than neurodegeneration-focused companies. We'll get into this probably later, but the human genetics revolution that's come through has generated this long list of targets that people think are high value for neurodegeneration, and that's not really been the case in psych. So it's a different playbook there.
Exactly. And to come is my next story on atlases, a roundup of the sort of molecular profiling that academics have done. And we identified some in these neuropsychiatric diseases. Look out for that as one of my next stories.
Awesome. And we'll get to neuropsych later in the show when we talk about Selena's conversation with Steve Paul, but we're going to take a quick break and we're going to turn to Wegovy and find out what's happening there. It's been a rapid fire bit of news across the bow over the past few days, and we'll hear about it from Steve after this.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new co's. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
All right, we are back. Steve, you wrote a perspective on Friday. I bet you never thought you'd be writing about hims and hers, but here you are.
Here I am with hims and hers. Yeah, what I wrote about, I think everybody knows the broad outlines of what's happened. Hims and hers put out an advertisement saying that they're going to be selling a compounded version of Wegovy's oral anti-obesity drug. There was a big outcry about that. FDA Commissioner Marty McCary went on X and said that FDA was going to take swift action against companies mass marketing illegal copycat drugs. Then the HHS chief counsel put out a more specific statement saying that they've referred hims and hers to the Department of Justice for prosecution, he wrote FDCNA and possible Title 18 provisions. And that last bit means federal criminal offenses like fraud. What I wrote and what I think is important is that what Hims is doing with oral Wegovy, and I think possibly with its other products, is an assault not just on Novo or other companies that sell similar products, but on the whole biopharma industry. And what FDA and what HHS need to do is demonstrate that its actions are not limited to Hims or to a particular product that has received widespread media attention. It has to enforce the boundary between pharma compounding and the approval system that underlies all biopharmaceutical innovation. And I say that because I think that the integrity of the whole drug approval system and the whole drug development system depends on a social contract. Companies invest in proving the safety and effectiveness of a product. They receive a defined period of market exclusivity. And if mass-marketed compounded copies are allowed to compete before that period ends, there's not going to be much incentive to develop new medicines in the first place.
So, Steve, I think maybe you could outline for people what the role is for compounding. Like, what is kosher compounding? What is the place that it has in the ecosystem? Why is it allowed and where?
Well, I'm not sure that any compounding is kosher, okay? But you need to go to a bigger authority than me to talk about that.
I'll ask the rabbi. We have rabbis for this, yes.
Okay. So here's the deal. It's complicated, okay? But there's two kinds of compounding, maybe more than that people usually think of. The traditional form of compounding is when a compounding pharmacy makes a product at the demand or request of a physician for a particular patient because there's nothing that's FDA approved that would be applicable for that patient. A classic example might be that there's a pediatric formulation that's needed. It's a patient who's too young to swallow a pill, and there's no liquid version of it on the market, so a compounder would create that liquid version for a particular patient for a particular product. There's also large-scale, there's provisions in the U.S. law, and this is more controversial, that allow large-scale compounding in cases where there's a shortage. And that was the case with semaglutide and some of the other GLP-1s. When they first came on the market, they were in shortage. The companies that were manufacturing them couldn't meet U.S. demand, so compounders were allowed to make large quantities of them. And they made large quantities of them. There were millions of doses of compounded semaglutide products that were sold in the United States. And I should say that the current FDA commissioner, Martin McCary, he was the chief science officer for a company called Sesame Health, that one of their principal lines of business was connecting patients with compounded versions of semaglutide during this period when it was legal to do so because there was a shortage of those products.
Steve, curious, is there a temptation or maybe a history of the government using compounding to relieve pricing pressure?
Yeah, there is. It's happened before. I've written about it. I call it kind of one of the darkest moments, really, for FDA prior to the current administration, which has had its share of dark moments, which was when FDA, under pressure from Congress and from the White House, said that it would look the other way and allow mass compounding of a drug that McKenna Pharmaceutical was making at that time. It was called 17P. It was a drug that's used to prevent premature births, and it was being marketed at a high price. There was a lot of public outcry about it, and FDA said, okay, well, it's going to look the other way and allow compounded versions of it on the market. They ultimately backed down in the face of political pressure, but there's been suggestions before Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was confirmed that he was sympathetic to the use of compounding as a way to reduce prices and to improve access. Former Deputy FDA Commissioner Josh Sharfstein had written in medical journals also proposing the use of enforcement discretion for compounding as a way to reduce pricing and to improve access for American patients. And all of this is highly problematic. One, because of the issues that I raised about the erosion of the incentives for drug development, for innovation, if it can just be wiped away by companies compounding. And two, because there's a history of tragic manufacturing problems with compounded drugs, of people dying, of people having serious illnesses because of subtherapeutic doses, super therapeutic doses, and contaminated products that come out of compounding pharmacies.
All right. Let's turn to the spending law real quick before we jump over to Selena and a little taste of neuropsychiatry. Steve, spending bill passed. I recall a lot of talk from the White House about slashing NIH funding, reorganizing NIH, like moving ARPA out of NIH, but haven't seen much of that. What's going on here?
Yeah, actually, I'm surprised that this hasn't gotten more attention than it has. Basically, the Trump administration made a bunch of requests to Congress. They wanted to cut the NIH budget by 40%. They wanted to codify some of the controversial steps that DOJ tried to impose in the first weeks of the Trump administration in terms of overhead reimbursement for academic institutions. They wanted to move ARPA-H out of NIH and into a newly created entity that would be charged with implementing the Make America Healthy Again ideology. Congress looked at all of this and kind of shrugged its shoulders and said, no, we're not doing it, right? They appropriated $48.7 billion for NIH. That's an increase of about $415 million compared to 2025. That's a big difference from cutting 40%, which the Trump administration wanted them to do. That would have put NIH's budget at $27.9 billion. As for this new entity that the Trump administration wanted Congress to create, Congress kind of looked at it and said, nope, we're not doing that. Same thing for the overhead formula that they wanted to create for NIH. Congress didn't do it. And in fact, it put some language in the law that makes it impossible or difficult for the Trump administration to do what it had tried to do in the early days of administration in terms of overhead policies for academic institutions. And then I should say very quickly, the other thing that was really important in the spending bill was the reauthorization of the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program. That's going to be really important in stimulating the development of gene and cell therapies for very rare diseases, mostly diseases that affect children. In the story that I wrote about it, I listed about 30 products that have received designation, rare pediatric designation, since the expiration of the voucher program. Now those products will all be eligible for vouchers. If past performance is any measure of what's going to happen going forward, probably about 10% of those will end up actually being approved as drugs and will get the vouchers. And I think that's important because none of them would have gone forward in the absence of a voucher.
All right. And then there's quite a few other things in there that help kids with rare diseases get access to drugs, which is you can read about in Steve's story. Steve, is this like a failure of RFK Jr.? Who is it, or is it just sort of like you said it was like kind of a shrug? Like what happened here? Why didn't Trump administration is pretty good at getting its way in a lot of areas. What happened here?
I think it's more of a reversion to the mean. And I think that it's something that we're probably going to see a little bit more of in the coming year or two. There's very few things that are more popular in Congress than funding biomedical research. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One reason, of course, is that it affects everyone. There's nobody who hasn't been touched by disease, and there's nobody who doesn't hope that American science will come up with therapies that are going to help them and are going to help their loved ones to live better lives. There also probably isn't a single member of Congress who doesn't have an institution in their district that receives NIH funding. And that's not by accident. NIH has deliberately over the years spread the money out in ways, and I think that you could say that that's a good thing. It's very unlikely that all of the good ideas in biomedicine are concentrated in the 2 or 3 places where the leading academic institutions are. But it's also been a deliberate policy in order to gain support in the Congress. And I think that as for some of the other measures, I think, again, the thing isn't surprising to me, for example, that they reauthorized pediatric PRVs. The real surprise is that it was such a heavy lift and that it was so difficult for them to do it because it's a no-brainer and because there's nobody who really opposes it. And even though it's something that has such clear and obvious benefits, it was a tremendous lift in order to get it across the finish line.
Well, I think, Steve, you're right. I mean, it's a question of how much more will we see this. This is bipartisan. In a way, it's low-hanging fruit for something that should be able to get across. And I think people are increasingly concerned about the threat from China and the devaluation or decimation or whichever word you want of U.S. biomedical science. So let's see how this plays out in the rest of the year and then going forward.
I think, really quickly, I think one other place where we're going to see it, President Trump came out and said that he wants Congress to codify MFN, most favored nation pricing for prescription drugs. And I think this is another area where we're going to see Congress take a look at it, including Republicans take a look at it and say, no, we're really not going to do that.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Selena, you had a great conversation on our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show, last week with Steve Paul. Steve Paul, of course, led Karuna Therapeutics, which BMS bought in 2023 for $14 billion. He's now board chair at Seaport, which he co-founded in 2024 with former leaders of PureTech Health. Selena, what did you learn talking to Dr. Paul?
Yeah, he was also behind Sage Therapeutics, which brought the first treatment for postpartum depression to the market. And he, before that, spent 17 years at Eli Lilly working in R&D and in neurosciences. So he's seen a lot. He's a veteran of this industry. One of the things when he tells his stories of these, how he identified certain kinds of biology and decided to take it forward, there is a lot of serendipity in those stories. You're developing something for one indication and you realize if you keep your eyes open, maybe it didn't work for that, but there's a subset where it worked in a way you didn't expect, and that becomes the germ for the thing that's ultimately successful. And there is maybe more of that in psychiatry than in other areas of drug development, even though it's a theme throughout drug development. But something that I think that to me really stood out, you can't build a systematic, rational approach to finding biology based on serendipity, right? You can keep your eyes open for it. But several of his examples follow another kind of theme. And when I was gathering up the catalyst, we did this big catalyst project, like what are the milestones coming this year? And I was doing the neuro ones. So I was poking around on lots of companies' websites, including across the psychiatry field. So his examples are not unique. Lots of companies in the psychiatry space are taking the approach of looking for molecules that have been in humans before. So when we talk about trying to find causal biology and base everything on human data as much as possible, often what that means for people is human genetics. While psychiatric diseases are very polygenetic and they have environmental triggers and they're just super heterogeneous, more so even than other things that we consider heterogeneous, right? So what does human biology look like? And it seems to me kind of the main theme, the main workhorse right now is clinical data. So there's a long track record of failed clinical trials in psychiatry, but many of those compounds produced interesting signals, but they had some kind of liability that held them back. That was the case in the Karuna story. That's the case with some of what Seaport is working on. If you go into Danielle's Series A analysis and you look at what were the 3 biggest fundraisers in neuroscience Series A's last year, one of those companies was Drag Therapeutics. Same thing. These are companies, veterans of Merck, GSK, who worked on AMPA receptor modulators in the past that had safety issues, and they now are coming back and figuring out how to solve those. That really stood out to me as kind of a unifying theme.
So, Selena, let me come back to what you said before, because that sort of worries me. If the unifying theme or one of the major marks of progress depends on serendipity, and you sort of indicated that might be more the case in psychiatry than other diseases, but if so, that would actually worry me because, as you said yourself, it's not a strategy. So,
Well, while there is a lot of serendipity, the point I was trying to make is the way you move away from serendipity and do something a bit more systematic using this approach, right, is you use the human biology that's available to you. And often that's the form of clinical data, human data from clinical trials. And you mine this large history of failures for things that actually showed some promise, but had some liability associated with them. That was the reason that blocked their progress. And now you do that with fresh eyes, using all the modern tools we have today. So the chemistry we can do today that we couldn't do then, the delivery we can do today that we couldn't do then. Seaport is a good example of this. It's a delivery play.
What I think I'm hearing you say that's very interesting is that in psychiatry, at least, given the new tools, there's a lot of reason to go back and look at the things that we couldn't move forward, we being the field, couldn't move forward in the past, that it isn't really serendipity. It's actually new tools and information that might allow us to build strategies towards making those products where we couldn't before, because we didn't have a precision approach kind of thing.
That's right. I mean, that conversation started about, it's all about serendipity, but which is frightening. I agree with you. But where it ended, or at least for me, as I was thinking about it, is it's not really all about serendipity. It's about engineering solutions. People always say, okay, we don't understand the biology of psychiatric conditions. We just don't know how they happen. And to an extent, that's true. But at the end of the day, it's all about synaptic activity in the brain. There's some set of synapses in a circuit or a couple of circuits that aren't behaving the way they're supposed to. So the fact that people are still tinkering with neurotransmitter receptors and ion channels and things is not necessarily a sign of lack of progress, right? Because those are how you manipulate synaptic transmission and normalize neural circuit activity. The point is to figure out why they failed in the past, and is there something in today's toolkit that can help make you do a more precise, job that separates the efficacy from the safety issues.
So it's precision, but it's precision with persistence, right? And the persistence is not just giving up when something doesn't seem to work, or when something doesn't work because it's too dangerous, but keeping on hammering at it and saying, well, is there a way to go around the problem that's causing the adverse effects that make something unacceptable from a safety standpoint?
Totally true. And what I think the thing that was so exciting about Karuna is that because it did that successfully, it was this example that you can do that. And it led to a $14 billion acquisition. So while a lot of pharmas got out of psychiatry, right, and it was kind of dead for a while, when you can do that, it shows that there is appetite on the buy side.
And I wonder, if you go back in history, also a lot of the psychiatric drugs that are being used now have adverse effect profiles that I think if somebody were to come into FDA with them now, they might not even get approved in the first place. Tardive dyskinesia is not a trivial thing. The other adverse effects that are associated with some of these very commonly prescribed psychiatric medicines are not things that maybe the FDA or other regulators would accept today.
Totally.
Selena, I have one more question on this front, at least from me, is, the Karuna very elegant solution was really a solution that is still based on very well-established targets and just sort of cleverly dialing out, again, using known modalities, known targets, dialing out the adverse side effects, which, I think there's probably more space for that in neuro than one might realize, but it's still going to be finite to some degree as a strategy. My question really is, to what degree do you think that new targets and new modalities are going to be a play, if you're able to say that, in psych? Are you seeing that? Because with genetics, we quite often think about going after genetic target with genetic medicines, right?
Right.
But a lot of
genetics
these are
hasn't
not
been
that.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So dialing out safety issues, like there's various ways to do that. In the case of Karuna, there's a combination therapy, but sometimes it's using a different chemistry solution, like making a better positive allosteric modulator. So that's one whole side of things. And I do think there's a lot of territory there. Another way to revisit something from the past and do it better is with better delivery. Seaport has one solution to that, which bypasses first pass metabolism, and kind of absorbs these things as if they're lipids, but they're not, they're small molecules. Then there's this whole arena of blood-brain barrier shuttles, which is taking off across all of neuroscience, neurology. I expect that will be useful in psych at some point too, although that's not the first place it's being applied. And there are other kind of overarching strategies with which you can revisit something from the past and do it differently now. Oh, one of the big ones, which is really nascent, but it's going to take off eventually, is finding biomarkers so that you can actually match a drug to the responders. Precision medicine, it's happening in cancer. It's been successful there for a while now. We have a few biotechs like Alto Neuroscience trying to do this in psychiatry, in some cases with older compounds, because now they think they know which of this very heterogeneous population is going to respond. We'll see how that plays out. Eventually it'll work. Whether it's in the short term or the long term, we don't know.
And I imagine the first place you're going to see it is in clinical trial recruitment and trying to enrich trials for patients who are likely to be responders.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. Well, Selena's wonderful conversation with Dr. Steve Paul, available wherever you get your podcasts, and like and subscribe and follow our podcast, The BioCentury Show and BioCentury This Week. And we will be back next Tuesday, the day after the U.S. President's holiday, with a fresh episode of BioCentury This Week. And a thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra for creating the music for all of our podcasts. And a shout out to our production guru, Cole Travis, who keeps things running at BioCentury with all of our multimedia needs.